Chapter 7. Does God exist? Learning objectives. 7.1 Explain the importance of analyzing religious beliefs with the help of reason. 7.2 Describe the classical theistic conception of God. 7.3 Evaluate different arguments for the existence of God. 7.4 Analyze arguments which try to establish that evil and suffering disprove the existence of God. 7.5 Evaluate your position on theism in light of all arguments. God, faith, and reason. 7.1 Explain the importance of analyzing religious beliefs with the help of reason. Some philosophical problems seem far removed from the way we live our day-to-day lives. However, this is not true when we deal with questions about God. If God exists, we must understand ourselves and the universe in terms of a relationship with a perfect and necessary being. Part of our lives should then be devoted to building this relationship through prayer, observance of religious rituals, or the reading of holy books like the Bible or the Quran. If, on the other hand, God does not exist, we are faced with a different situation. While we would be free to dismiss most religious activities as nonsense, we would have to accept the idea that we are finite beings who live in a universe without ultimate meaning or purpose. The question of whether God exists is therefore of obvious interest, and the answer we give to the question has an immediate impact upon our lives and our understanding of the world. It is nevertheless frequently difficult to engage people in a thorough discussion about God's existence. Many people hold that religious beliefs are a matter of faith only and should not be scrutinized with the help of reason. For them, religious beliefs are a matter of the heart, faith, and not a matter of the head, reason. There is something to be said for this position. Some well-known philosophers such as Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855, have defended it, but extreme versions of this so-called fideistic approach to religious beliefs are difficult to justify. To illustrate this difficulty, consider the following example. Suppose you find out that a friend of yours has joined a radical religious group that considers higher education a work of the devil and consequently advocates the destruction of all college campuses. The next time you meet your friend, he is on his way to class with dynamite strapped to his body. You feel a strong moral obligation to stop him, but how? If you are stronger than he is, you might try to wrestle him to the ground, or you might try to get the help of a nearby police officer. But suppose that there is no police officer and that your friend is much stronger than you. At this point, your only option is to try to convince your friend with the help of arguments that he is mistaken to think that God wants all college campuses to be destroyed. Of course, this is an extreme example, but it suggests that all of us, whether we are Christians, atheists, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or advocates of some other religious perspective, have an obligation to test and analyze our religious beliefs by means of reason. Reason might not be able to answer all religious questions, but it can provide a framework that prevents people from misusing religious sentiments for dangerous ends. It is, therefore, a vital task to determine to what degree we can justify religious beliefs with the help of rational evidence. In this chapter, we will limit ourselves to exploring one of the most fundamental religious questions: does God exist? Food for thought. On 11th May 2003, Diane Laney, a 39-year-old mother and housewife, stoned two of her children to death and seriously injured a third. When asked for an explanation, she said, "I felt like I obeyed God, and I believe there will be good out of this. I feel like He will reveal His power, and they will be raised up. They will become alive again." This story illustrates one of the inherent difficulties in radical fideism. If we accept our religious beliefs without checking whether they are reasonable or not, we have no way of excluding extreme and fanatical religious beliefs. Can you think of other examples in which accepting religious beliefs on the basis of blind faith alone might lead to harmful consequences? Food for thought. What properties are essential to God? Decide whether you believe that the following assertions about God are true or false. 1. God is eternal. 2. God is male. 3. God has a physical body. 4. God is all-powerful, omnipotent. 5. God knows everything, omniscient. 6. God reveals himself differently in different cultures. 7. God is all-good, omnibenevolent. 8. God is the greatest being that we can think of. 9. God and Jesus are one and the same person. 10. God is everywhere in nature. 11. God helps those who deserve help. 12. God causes miracles. 13. God is sometimes really mad at human beings. 14. God loves all humans equally. 15. God is so different from us that we have no idea what God is like. 16. When I talk to God, I know that He listens. 17. God likes some countries, example, the United States, more than other countries. What do we mean by the word God? 7. To describe the classical theistic conception of God. At first glance it might seem as if we can respond to the question of whether God exists in only two ways. Either we answer with a yes and embrace a theistic position, or we answer with a no and support a version of atheism. However, there are more than two options here. For one, we may decide to subscribe to an agnostic position, which holds that it is possible for God to exist but that we humans can never know whether that possibility is actually true. A further complication is raised by the inherent ambiguity of the term God. Although most people, approximately 88% of the American population, agree that God exists, many people have conflicting ideas about what kind of being God is supposed to be. Some understand God as universal energy, whereas others see and experience God as a personal friend. Unless we can clarify what we mean by the term God, we can hardly determine whether there are any good reasons to believe that such a being exists. As you can see from this exercise, there can be much disagreement about which properties are essential to God. To gain some point of reference, we can divide the various conceptions of God into three broad categories: classical theism, pantheism, and New Age conception, as illustrated in the adjacent diagram. This classification is somewhat simplistic, but it nevertheless helps us to see that classical theism, the view of God supported by the three major theistic religions of the world, is not the only conception of God. Notably, Asian religions embrace a quite different perspective. In the Western philosophical tradition, however, most thinkers have embraced a classical theistic conception of God, and we will focus our discussion on that viewpoint. However, this does not mean that we will disregard non-classical conceptions of God completely. Later in this chapter, we will see that certain philosophical puzzles might be approached differently if we revise the classical conception of God. Let us begin by clarifying classical theism in more detail. According to classical theism, God has several key features. God is the creator of the universe, and He is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, worthy of worship. He is infinite, everlasting, and not dependent on anything other than Himself, i.e., He is self-existent and necessary. Most importantly, the classical theistic God of the Torah, the New Testament, and the Quran is a person. That means that God is the kind of being who can act, who is capable of love and creativity, and who can enter into relationships with humans. It is by virtue of God's personhood that God can be our friend or helper. The philosopher Richard Swinburne defines the God of classical theism as follows: a person without a body, i.e., a spirit, present everywhere, the creator and sustainer of the universe, a free agent, able to do anything, i.e. omnipotent, knowing all things, perfectly good, a source of moral obligation, immutable, eternal, a necessary being, holy and worthy of worship. Classical theism does not yield a completely unified conception of God. There are many questions that are hotly debated within this broad tradition. For example, is God capable of having emotions, or is he impassible? To what degree does God know the future? What is the relationship between God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus? Which, if any, is the true word of God, the Quran, the Torah, or the Bible? In spite of these difficulties, it is nevertheless possible to extract a fairly coherent conception of God from these three theistic religions. From here on, we will understand the question of whether God exists as a question of whether an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and personal creator of the universe exists. So far, our discussion has helped us clarify what we mean by the term God, but this does not yet help us to understand what reason tells us about God. Does reason tell us that classical theism is true? Or does reason tell us the opposite? Is reason perhaps unable to settle the question, and should we therefore adopt an agnostic position? In order to answer this question, we need to take a closer look at the various arguments for and against classical theism. In the following pages, we will explore a multitude of arguments for and against classical theism. Since the discussion involves so many different points of view, it is possible to get lost. To keep track of the big picture view of our discussion, the graphic overview above should be helpful. Arguments in defense of classical theism. 7.3 Evaluate different arguments for the existence of God. Arguments from religious experiences. Some of the most persuasive arguments in defense of the existence of God are based on religious experiences. Consider the following description of a religious experience. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looks, and lo, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. Suppose for a moment that you have a chance to speak with Moses after he had the experience just described. Suppose you ask, Moses, do you have any reason to believe that God exists? Wouldn't Moses be amused by that question? What better reason can one have for thinking that God exists than hearing God's voice in a burning bush? Let us become clear on the nature of the argument that stands behind Moses' reasoning. In standard form, the argument can be represented as follows. 1. I have experiences that seem to be caused by God. 2. The best explanation for these experiences is that God indeed has caused them. Therefore, God probably exists. This is an inductive argument. It aims to establish its conclusion with a high degree of probability even if we have experiences that seem to have been caused by God. It is of course possible that we are mistaken and that these experiences have been caused by something else, example, hallucinations, wishful thinking, sleep deprivation. The argument does not overlook this possibility, but it tries to establish that it is much more likely that the religious experiences were caused by God rather than by hallucinations or some other cause. In order to understand the thrust of the argument better, it is useful to compare this argument with a related argument that tries to establish the existence of mind-independent physical objects. In standard form, the argument can be presented as follows. 1. I have experiences that seem to be caused by mind-independent physical objects, example, chairs or tables. 2. The best explanation for these experiences is that mind-independent physical objects indeed caused my experiences. Therefore, mind-independent physical objects, Example, chairs or tables probably exist. This argument strikes me as a perfectly plausible argument in defense of my belief that mind-independent physical objects exist in the world. It is natural to think that the best explanation for my visual experiences of physical objects is that there are indeed physical objects out there. Of course, the possibility exists that I am mistaken about this and that I am really just a brain in a vat or a person trapped in the matrix. But these scenarios seem far-fetched and not very likely to be true. The argument, therefore, establishes its conclusion with a high degree of probability, and that is all that matters for a good inductive argument. Once we realize that the argument in support of the existence of mind-independent physical objects is cogent, we can take advantage of the similarity between the two arguments and advance the following argument by analogy. 1. The inductive argument that tries to establish the existence of mind-independent physical objects on the basis of our experiences of these objects provides us with a good reason for thinking that there are mind-independent physical objects. 2. The argument that tries to establish the existence of God on the basis of our experiences of God is similar to the argument that tries to establish the existence of mind-independent physical objects on the basis of our experiences of these objects. Therefore, the argument that tries to establish the existence of God on the basis of experiences of God provides us with a good reason for thinking that God exists. This argument by analogy is attractive. However, in order to assess whether we ought to accept this argument, we need to compare the two arguments in more detail. The crucial question is whether the two arguments are sufficiently similar. Does the argument that infers the existence of God from religious experiences resemble the argument that infers the existence of external physical objects from my experiences of these objects? Or are there significant and relevant differences that undermine the argument by analogy? Let us explore this question in more detail. First, it is clear that experiences of physical objects are widespread. Nearly everyone has had visual experiences of tables or chairs. Religious experiences, on the other hand, are much rarer. Moses might have heard God's voice in a burning bush, and Joseph Smith might have seen the angel Moroni in the forest, but most of us have never had these kinds of experiences. This weakens the argument, but it does not pose a decisive objection. We can respond to this concern by limiting the scope of the argument. Although the argument does not work for everyone, it might work for those who have had relevant religious experiences. In addition, we can point out that even somebody who has never had a religious experience in the past could have such an experience in the future. This would assure that the argument is at least of some interest to those who lack the relevant experiences. A second, more serious problem with the argument is raised by concerns about the trustworthiness, reliability of the religious experiences. It cannot be denied that some religious experiences are the product of wishful thinking, lively imaginations, and hallucinations. Does this indicate that all religious experiences can never be trusted and should not be counted as evidence? In order to clarify this issue, the contemporary American philosopher Richard Swinburne introduced the so-called principle of credulity, which says that if a person has experiences that seem to be of I, then the person has reason to believe that I exist unless the person has further reason to indicate that the experiences should not be trusted. Let us see how the principle of credulity works in the case of visual experiences. Suppose, for instance, that it is late at night and I am walking through a forest. Suddenly, it seems to me that I see a vampire behind a tree. In this situation, the principle of credulity says that my experience of seeing a vampire does not give me a reason to think that vampires exist because I know that my visual experiences are not reliable when walking through a dark forest. However, the principle of credulity would say that my visual experience of seeing a yellow frog in front of me in broad daylight when I am not intoxicated provides a very good reason for thinking that yellow frogs exist. What then should we say about religious experiences? Suppose that it seems to me that I experience God's presence. Suppose further that I am aware that I am very tired when I am having this religious experience. Does my being tired give me reason to think that my religious experience is unreliable? It is impossible to know for sure because nobody knows under what conditions religious experiences are reliable perceptions of a higher reality. We simply do not know how religious experiences work. Different philosophers draw different conclusions from this. Richard Swinburne, for instance, thinks that the fact that we do not know whether religious experiences are unreliable gives us a reason to take them as evidence. Many other philosophers, however, think that our ignorance about when religious experiences are reliable and our inability to corroborate religious experiences with others make it impossible to treat them as evidence. However, even if we accept religious experiences as evidence, we must acknowledge that we are much better in identifying under what conditions our visual experiences are reliable than we are at recognizing under what conditions religious experiences are reliable. This marks a clear difference between ordinary visual experiences and religious experiences, and thus weakens the argument by analogy. A final worry about appeals to religious experiences is that they seem to support contradictory claims about God. People in different religions experience the Supreme Being in different ways. A Muslim has experiences that seem to be of Allah, a Christian has experiences that seem to be of Jesus, and a Hindu has experiences that seem to be of Krishna. If the argument from religious experience works with one religious tradition, it is hard to see why it would not work in other religious traditions as well. This means that the argument from religious experience accepted does not establish the existence of one supreme being with attributes that reflect one particular religious tradition. On the contrary, if we accept this argument, we have just as much reason to believe in the existence of Krishna as in the existence of Allah or any other supreme being. In order to respond to this difficulty, one might conclude that the argument from religious experience does not establish that a supreme being exists, but perhaps only that some form of ultimate reality exists. This result, however, does not offer much help in our attempt to determine whether there are good reasons for thinking that classical theism is true. There can be no doubt that religious experiences are a powerful element in the lives of many believers, but our discussion shows that they probably cannot provide any decisive and intersubjective ground for establishing the existence of God. William James expressed the situation well when he wrote, "Religious experiences have the right to be absolutely authoritative over the individual to whom they come. But no authority emanates from them which should make it a duty for those who stand outside of them to accept their revelations." The cosmological argument. An alternative strategy for trying to establish the existence of God is to infer the existence of God from the existence of the universe, or cosmos. The cosmological argument, which has a long history that reaches back to the writings of Plato and Aristotle, can be presented either as a deductive or as an inductive argument. Deductive versions of the argument have been more popular, but we will focus on an inductive version that I believe provides the most attractive version of the argument. In order to understand the basic thrust of the cosmological argument, we need to understand two philosophical ideas, the concept of a necessary being and the principle of sufficient reason, which we encountered in our discussion of free will. Let us start by reviewing this principle. Consider the following example. Suppose that you are walking through a remote forest and come across the ruins of a huge ancient city. You do not know what civilization created this city, and you certainly do not know why they created a city in this particular place, but you are sure that there is some explanation for why the city exists. This seems true not only for cities in remote forests but also for things in general. I might not know why I have a terrible headache, but I am sure that there is an explanation for the throbbing pain in my skull. Or I might not know why President Kennedy was shot in 1963, but I am certain that an explanation exists. This is the principle of sufficient reason. For anything that exists, there must be an explanation, i.e., a sufficient reason of why it exists. Let us now turn our attention to the concept of a necessary being. In order to understand this concept, it might be useful to explore its antonym, namely, the concept of a contingent being. I myself am a good example of a contingent being. I was born in the year 1965 and have been in existence ever since. However, I am acutely aware of that my existence is not necessary but contingent. At any given point, something could happen that would put an end to my existence. I might have a heart attack, or a stray bullet might hit my head. Whether I continue to exist depends on many contingent factors, and what is true for me and my existence seems to be true for many other things as well. The tree outside my office window could burn, and the coffee cup on my desk could fall and break. The tree and the coffee cup are also contingent beings. Is there anything that exists with necessity? Are there beings that cannot be destroyed and that never have come into existence? Such necessary beings, if they exist, are very different from you and me. Necessary beings have always existed and are not brought into existence by anything else. They are self-sufficient and self-explanatory. We are now in a good position to take a closer look at the logic of the cosmological argument. The basic structure of the argument can be presented as follows. 1. The world, or cosmos, exists. 2. There must be an explanation of why the world exists. 3. The best explanation of why the world exists is that the world was created by a necessary being. Therefore, 4. A necessary being probably exists. 5. This necessary being is God. Therefore, God probably exists. Let us take a look at the various steps of the argument. The first premise is easy to accept. There can be no doubt that the cosmos exists, that's a fact. The second premise is supported by the principle of sufficient reason. If there must be an explanation for everything, it seems to follow that there must be an explanation for the existence of the world. The third premise is more difficult to justify. Why should we think that the best explanation of the existence of the world is that a necessary being created it? Clearly, there are other explanations available that should be compared in order to judge which is the best. From a logical point of view, we can identify three possible explanations, as illustrated in the adjacent chart. Let us start by analyzing the first option. Even if we believe that our current cosmos originated with the Big Bang, it is still conceivable that the cosmos itself is eternal. We can imagine, for instance, that the currently expanding universe will at some point, by virtue of gravitational forces, start to contract. In this scenario, called the Big Crunch, the universe ultimately will collapse onto itself. After it has completely collapsed, the universe may restart itself with another big explosion and thus begin the cycle anew. We can imagine that this process has always been going on. If so, there may be no absolute beginning to the universe. In this endless state of renewal and destruction, it has always been around. Is there anything wrong with this idea? To accept the idea of a universe that extends infinitely back in time, one must also accept that an infinite series exists. However, defenders of the cosmological argument argue that the idea of an existing infinite series is incoherent. Let me illustrate this with an example. Suppose that you come across an old man in the forest who is mumbling to himself. As you approach, you can hear that he is counting backwards. He says, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hooray, I am done. I have counted them all. You ask him what he has been counting, and he replies that he has counted all of the natural numbers. "Whoa," you exclaim, "that must have taken a long time. When did you start?" The old man replies, "You fool. There are infinitely many natural numbers, so obviously I never started." This example illustrates that there is something suspicious about an existing process that extends backwards into infinity. Some philosophers argue that an existing infinite series is an incoherent idea. But even if we grant that the concept of an existing infinite series is coherent, we still face a serious problem. To grant that the universe has existed forever would still offer no explanation of why it exists. As the philosopher Richard Taylor has pointed out, giving the world an age even if it is an infinite age does not in any way answer the question of why the world exists. This suggests that option 1 does not provide any explanation of why the cosmos exists. The second option suggests that the universe started with the Big Bang. According to this hypothesis, the universe started with nothingness, i.e., a vacuum. Prior to the Big Bang, there was neither time nor space. I stress this point because people are prone to ask, what caused the Big Bang? The sensible answer to this question is that the question itself is flawed. The Big Bang cannot be caused by anything. It is a singular event that simply happened, that's all one can say. At first glance, one might be suspicious of such an answer. Does it make sense to assume that physical events simply happen in the absence of any cause? Surprisingly, modern physics supports this idea, especially with respect to quantum phenomena. Take the example of radioactive decay. Although we know the time when a certain amount of uranium-239 has decayed by 50% to uranium-238, the so-called half-life, we do not know when an individual molecule, i.e., atom, will lose its neutron. That process is due to chance. Defenders of the Big Bang hypothesis think that the Big Bang was a similar physical event without proper cause. There is a certain probability that a quantum vacuum produced the conditions for the rapid inflation that characterized the early stages of our universe. That is all we can say. But isn't there something terribly unsatisfactory about this picture, that there was nothing whatsoever, and then suddenly there was a rapidly expanding universe? The Big Bang hypothesis leads to the same quandary as the eternal cosmos hypothesis. It does not offer us a satisfactory explanation of the existence of the universe. This situation leads supporters of the cosmological argument to conclude that the best explanation of the existence of the universe is the claim that it was created by a necessary being. But is not this explanation just as incomplete and deficient as the other two options? If we claim that a necessary being created the universe, don't we also have to ask how the necessary being came into being? Let us recall that a necessary being is eternal and uncreated, self-explanatory and self-sufficient. Only a necessary being is self-sustaining and contains the reason for its existence in itself. Thus, a necessary being can provide an explanation of the existence of the universe that seems more complete and less puzzling than the alternative explanations. If we accept this conclusion, we have good reason to think that premise 3 of the cosmological argument is true and that the best explanation of the world's existence is its creation by a necessary being. Premises 1, 2 and 3 together support the conclusion that a necessary being probably exists. And since any necessary being has many features that we normally attribute to the god of classical theism, it is tempting to think that the necessary being that provides the best explanation of the existence of the universe is identical to the god of classical theism. Thus, insofar as we have found good reason to believe that a necessary being exists, we have also found good reason to think that God exists. Unquestionably, the cosmological argument is appealing, but in order to assess its significance, we need to explore some objections that have been raised against it. There are several that are worth our attention. First, Premise 2 of the argument says that there must be an explanation of the existence of the cosmos, yet it is not entirely clear that we need to accept this premise. We have seen that the premise is supported by the principle of sufficient reason. But why do we have to accept this general principle that we can find an explanation for everything that exists? Is it not possible that there are so-called brute facts, that is, facts which are true but which cannot be explained by reference to other facts? Think about the fact that hydrogen is one of the 118 fundamental chemical elements. This is true, but can we explain why it is true? It is a fundamental physical fact that hydrogen is a chemical element, but that is all we can say. No deeper explanation seems to be forthcoming no matter how hard we might think about this fact. The same kind of thinking can be applied to the fact that the universe exists. This, too, is true, but we might reject the idea that we can explain why it is true. If we follow this line of thought, we end up rejecting premise 2 of the cosmological argument. Moreover, even if we accept the principle of sufficient reason and demand an explanation of everything in the world, it is not clear that the world as a whole needs a reason as well. Advocates of the cosmological argument seem to commit the fallacy of composition. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, 1711 to 1776, remarked on this topic, "Did I show you the particular causes of each individual in a collection of 20 particles of matter, I should think it very unreasonable should you afterwards ask me, what was the cause of the whole 20? It seems to follow that the principle of sufficient reason supports the idea that each individual entity in this world needs an explanation of its existence, but does not support the idea that the world as a whole needs such an explanation. A further objection to the cosmological argument relates to premise 3, which asserts that explaining the existence of the cosmos in terms of a necessary being is better than explaining the existence of the cosmos in terms of the Big Bang. It is not clear that we need to accept this conclusion. According to Occam's razor, we have reason to prefer a simpler hypothesis to a more complicated one. And the Big Bang hypothesis is certainly simpler than the creation hypothesis since it does not require any reference to necessary beings. The British physicist Stephen Hawking wrote in this context, "Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going." If we follow Hawking's line of thought, we can make a good case that premise 3 might be false. Finally, even if we accept the first 3 premises of the cosmological argument, and thus accept that a necessary being brought the universe into existence, it is not clear that this necessary being is the God of classical theism. Although the cosmological argument might establish that a necessary being probably exists, it cannot show us that this necessary being is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and worthy of worship. Thus, the cosmological argument leaves the character of God undetermined and therefore cannot establish on its own that the God of classical theism exists. The design argument. The design argument is one of the most popular theistic arguments. It has a long and complex history, but the basic idea behind it can be illustrated with this thought experiment. Suppose that you are a space explorer on a mission to find new intelligent life forms. At this moment you are the first in men to walk on planet Alpha Nu, which is barren, and for hours you have seen only dust. There is no sign of water or vegetation, and you decide to radio back to your crew that there is no intelligent life on this planet and that it is time to move on. Suddenly you step on something in the dust. As you bend down to pick it up, you realize that it is a computer memory chip. At once this discovery puts planet Alpha Nu in a different category. Although the planet seems devoid of intelligent life now, the memory chip proves that some form of intelligent life must have been present in the past. Perhaps those who left the memory chip were visitors like you, or perhaps this chip is a remnant of a lost civilization. Regardless, the discovery of the memory chip supports the following kind of reasoning. 1. There are memory chips on planet Alpha Nu. 2. Memory chips are carefully arranged and organized entities. 3. Carefully arranged and organized entities are most likely designed by an intelligent designer. Therefore, an intelligent designer most likely has been present on planet Alpha Nu. This is a strong inductive argument. A similar argument can be made with respect to Earth. This parallel argument goes as follows. 1. There are many plants and animals on Earth. 2. Plants and animals are carefully arranged and organized entities. 3. Carefully arranged and organized entities are most likely designed by an intelligent designer. Therefore, an intelligent designer most likely has been present on Earth. 4. This intelligent designer is God. Therefore, God most likely exists. This argument is immediately plausible, and for centuries it has been one of the most dependable bulwarks of rational theology. But does it stand up to closer scrutiny? The crucial premise of this argument is the third premise. Is it reasonable to assume that the most plausible explanation for the apparent design of living organisms found on Earth is the presence and influence of an intelligent designer? There are obviously other possible explanations available. Broadly, we can identify three competing hypotheses, which are illustrated by the adjacent chart. This brief overview is a bit simplistic, of course. There are, for instance, countless other accounts of creation besides the one in the Bible's Genesis. However, we do little harm if we group them together into one logical category, since the most potent arguments against the Genesis account of creation apply to other creation stories as well. Furthermore, by characterizing the theory of evolution as one theory, I do not want to imply that there are no theoretical differences among evolutionary biologists about the precise paths of evolutionary development or the relative importance of various evolutionary mechanisms. But for the purposes of discussing the design argument, we can characterize the theory of evolution as consisting of two main claims. 1. All living creatures have evolved from a few original simple life forms, the common descent hypothesis, which leads to the image of the tree of life. 2. The tree of life has been shaped by natural selection of randomly varying genetic differences among descendants. The first claim is pretty easy to understand, but the second might require some further explanation. One of the key insights of evolutionary theory is that descendants of the same parents will vary from each other. For example, if I should happen to have 4 children, they would differ genetically from each other. These differences are due to random processes and would give my children differing probabilities of reproductive success. What is true for my descendants is true for all other living beings as well. Frog and beetle parents have genetically differing offspring, just as I do. And not all offspring will do well. According to the theory of evolution, genetic differences combined with the forces of natural selection slowly over millions of years add up and both create and shape the tree of life. I have labeled the third possible explanation of the multiplicity and variety of living organisms as intelligent design creationism. Again, this is an oversimplification. There are in fact several creation theories that differ substantially from traditional creationism, for instance, Old Earth creationism, theistic evolutionism, and progressive creationism. However, because intelligent design creationism seems to play the most central role in the current debate about the design argument, we will focus our discussion on this form of non-traditional creationism. The key idea of intelligent design creationism is to reject a literal reading of Genesis and to accept, to varying degrees, the results of modern science. Intelligent design creationists accept that the Earth is billions of years old and that species have developed over time. These creationists insist, however, that God plays an important and necessary part in the creation of life and in the process of shaping the tree of life. Moreover, all intelligent design creationists reject the idea that a naturalistically interpreted theory of evolution provides a satisfactory explanation for life on Earth. Let us now analyze how plausible these competing hypotheses are. Clearly, the theory of evolution is more plausible than traditional creationism, which involves too many claims that are at odds with our scientific knowledge of the world. First, according to our current understanding of chemistry and physics, the world is roughly 5 billion years old, not 6,000 years, as traditional creationists maintain. It is possible for a traditional creationist to dismiss all results of modern science, but this is an awkward move to make. Second, we have plenty of paleontological evidence that many species, example, dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, Irish elks, existed in the past but do not exist anymore. This suggests that the actual number of life forms on Earth changes constantly and is a result of dynamic processes. Traditional creationism supports the idea that the total number of species were all created at the same time and that each species has a unique function and role in creation as a whole. In light of the paleontological evidence, that claim appears implausible. Third, we have plenty of evidence that many species are not designed in a perfect way. Many animals have rudimentary, i.e., vestigial, or atrophied organs. For example, ostriches still have wings, although they cannot fly. Why would a perfect creator have given them wings? It is more plausible to explain these imperfections with natural selection. The ostrich, like all other flightless birds, is likely a descendant of ancestors that could fly, but the ostrich developed stronger legs that enabled it to get by without flying. The wings are still useful to the ostrich but do not play the same role they played in the lives of its ancestors. These and similar observations provide strong evidence that species such as the ostrich have evolved from other species. The creationist claim that ostriches have been designed by a perfect designer seems contrived. In addition, if we take a close look at different animals, as Charles Darwin did, we can discover many instances of cross-species patterns. Darwin wrote, "What can be more curious than that the hand of a man, formed for grasping, that of a mole for digging, the leg of the horse, the paddle of the porpoise, and the wing of the bat, should all be constructed on the same pattern, and should include the same bones, in the same relative positions." The existence of cross-species patterns, so-called homologies, is difficult to reconcile with the claim that an original designer created all species from scratch. What reason could the original designer have had for creating the wings of a bat or the leg of a horse from a common design? The functions of the organs are very different, so it would have been reasonable to make the designs different as well. The fact that the same design patterns can be found across very different species supports the idea that different species developed from the same ancestors, and thus supports the tree of life hypothesis. If we take all these points together, we can safely conclude that traditional creationism is a weak competitor to the theory of evolution. Things look a bit different if we compare intelligent design creationism with a naturalistic version of the theory of evolution. Intelligent design creationists accept the basic tenets of the theory of evolution. They believe in the tree of life hypothesis and also believe that natural selection is responsible for shaping the pool of living creatures. However, intelligent design creationists maintain that God still has a role to play in all of this. Is this a plausible idea? Well, there are some interesting reasons in defense of intelligent design creationism. First, the classical theory of evolution presupposes that during the early stages of life on Earth, there existed many, albeit primitive, life forms that competed with each other for the available resources on Earth. But this does not explain where life itself came from. How did the first protein, the first enzyme, or the first DNA or RNA molecule come to be? An intelligent design creationist maintains that only with reference to God can we explain how life originated in the first place. The Cambridge astrophysicist Fred Hoyle calculated that the probability of a small, typical enzyme forming randomly is comparable to the probability that a tornado whipping through a junkyard would stir up the scrap to form a Boeing 747. Intelligent design creationists thus conclude that it is unreasonable to believe that life originated as the result of random processes. This is a tempting line of reasoning, but defenders of the naturalistic theory of evolution contend that no special explanation is needed for the fact that a certain highly unlikely event actually happened. After all, something or other had to happen. To illustrate this response, consider the following example. Suppose that you are in a building together with 500 other people. Suddenly, there is a fire alarm, and all 500 people leave the building, one after the other, through the front door. Because the chief of the fire department keeps track of the people who leave the building, at the end of the fire drill, the chief knows who left the building first, second, and so on. The probability that these 500 people left the building in one particular sequence is very, very small. However, the fact that one particular sequence actually did obtain can be explained best with reference to random processes. It does not require any reference to supernatural forces. Defenders of the theory of evolution can say something very similar about how proteins or amino acids came to exist on Earth. Although the probability that random processes produced these macromolecules is very small, we cannot reject a possible explanation simply because it requires us to believe that events with a low degree of probability can happen. After all, some events had to take place, and it might as well have been one with a low degree of probability. A second reason that some thinkers prefer intelligent design creationism to the theory of evolution has to do with the fact that the fossil records found thus far are not complete. According to a naturalistic version of the theory of evolution, the development of new species is a gradual process. However, the fossil records sometimes simply show that during certain periods, example, the Cambrian era, 600 million years ago, lots of new species seem to have come into existence all of a sudden. Intelligent design creationists can interpret this as evidence that these sudden accelerated periods of evolution are signs that a conscious designer was at work. Defenders of naturalistic evolution will of course not be impressed by this argument. They can insist that an incomplete fossil record is not something surprising. Not all periods of evolutionary development have necessarily left permanent traces. Moreover, sudden accelerated periods of evolutionary development can be well explained without reference to supernatural forces. Notice that the same piece of evidence can be interpreted as being compatible with both a naturalistic version of the theory of evolution and a modified version of creationism. Defenders of the naturalistic theory of evolution have a different but powerful argument at their disposal. The principle of Occam's razor favors the theory of evolution over intelligent design creationism. Since the naturalistically interpreted theory of evolution does not make reference to supernatural beings, it is a simpler theory than intelligent design creationism. However, the use of Occam's razor is similar to our experience with the principle of sufficient reason. Although we use it frequently, it is uncertain whether we have to apply it in all cases. The debate between intelligent design creationism and naturalistic evolutionism has long been intense and is likely to remain so for quite some time. Even if we were to establish that the intelligent design creationist has the more plausible position, we would encounter the same difficulty that we faced previously in the context of the cosmological argument. For even if we are convinced that the complexity and beauty of life on Earth can be best explained with reference to a conscious designer, it is in no way evident that the designer resembles the god of classical theism. We are left to wonder whether the designer is omnipotent, all good, and worthy of worship. Food for thought. Traditional creationists frequently insist that Darwin's theory of evolution is simply conjecture. It is certainly true that most evolutionary processes cannot be observed and verified by direct observation since they take too much time for direct observation. They often last millions of years. Does the fact that evolutionary processes are not directly observable justify the conclusion that the theory of evolution is only conjecture? Food for thought. The Navajo creation story is quite different from the account of Genesis. According to the Navajos, the world where people first lived was deep within the world we inhabit now. It had no sun or moon and certainly only dim clouds, which moved to tell the hours. Life began peacefully, but then lust and envy took hold. The people became violent. The Navajos fled, climbing through a hole in the sky to a world above. This world also began peacefully, but the same evils appeared, and the process repeated itself until finally the first man and woman emerged on the present earth. The first man filled the world with the aid of a sacred bundle of medicine, transforming different items into mountains, animals, hours, and so on. Everything in this new world was balanced, 4 directions, 4 seasons, and 4 basic colors of black, blue, umber, and white. An essential harmony, called Hojo, prevailed. Is this creation story any more or less likely to be true than the creation story in Genesis? Food for thought. In some school districts in the United States, parents have insisted that traditional creationism should be taught in school alongside the theory of evolution. For example, in 2005 in Dover, Pennsylvania, the local school board voted to require teachers to read a statement about intelligent design prior to discussion of evolution in high school biology classes. The argument for this position is that schools have a duty to introduce a variety of different theories about one topic and let students themselves decide which of the theories they would like to adopt. What do you think about this proposal? Do you agree that traditional creationism should be taught in biology classes, along with the theory of evolution? Food for thought. The probability that life on Earth arose out of purely natural processes is very small. Does this fact entitle us to conclude that God must have had a hand in the creation of we? The following thought experiment by the philosopher Richard Swinburne should help you decide what to think about this. Suppose you are imprisoned by a mad scientist who locks you in a room with an automatic card shuffling machine. He tells you that unless the card shuffling machine draws 10 aces of hearts from 10 different decks, the machine will explode and kill you. To your amazement, the machine does indeed draw 10 aces of hearts from 10 different decks, and you continue to live another day. Would you believe in this situation that your survival is due to pure luck? Or would you conclude that the mad scientist must have manipulated the machine? The ontological argument. Among the various arguments for God's existence, the ontological argument is probably the most intriguing and puzzling. The first thinker to present a version of this argument was the theologian Street, Anselm, 1033 to 1109. The central tenet of the argument is the claim that those who think that God does not exist involve themselves in a contradiction. This claim is not only questionable but outrageously bold. Why should it be the case that God's non-existence involves a contradiction? This is by no means obvious and requires further explanation. In order to understand the ontological argument better, it is useful to reflect on the logic of negative existential claims. Suppose somebody claims, goblins do not exist. Suppose further that I ask that person what kind of creature goblins are supposed to be, and he answers, one have no idea what goblins are, but I know for a fact that they do not exist. In this case, it seems obvious that the person's ignorance about goblins undermines the cogency of his claim that goblins do not exist. If one does not know what kind of creatures goblins are, one surely cannot have any reason to think that they do not exist. The same is true for atheists. An atheist who claims that God does not exist must have an idea of what kind of being God is supposed to be. If she does not, then her claim that God does not exist is undermined. Anselm suggested that both atheists and theists should agree that the idea of God is the idea of the greatest being that we can think of. This is a plausible definition, and it is hard to see how atheists can deny it. We thus have made some progress in our quest to understand the ontological argument. The claim that God does not exist is equivalent to the claim that the greatest being that one can think of does not exist. Let us analyze this claim a bit further. Suppose I tell you, the best marriage that I can think of unfortunately does not exist. What this seems to say is that I have a clear idea in my mind, or understanding, of what a perfect marriage is, but that it is only an idea and not something that exists. In reality, all real marriages, I might think, have at least some tiny flaw. Now let us apply this line of thought to the statement that the greatest being that one can think of does not exist. If we follow the same line of thought as we did before, we will understand this claim as follows: the greatest being that one can think of exists only in the understanding but not in reality. We are actually very close to grasping why supporters of the ontological argument think that the sentence is self-contradictory. All we need is one additional metaphysical principle. The principle in question can be summarized as follows: existence in reality is greater than existence only in the understanding. Let us consider an example. Suppose I have to choose between two steaks. One steak is grilled to perfection but exists only in my imagination, whereas the other one is a bit cold and tough but is sitting right in front of me. It seems clear that I would choose the steak that is sitting right in front of me. Imaginary steaks, even if grilled to perfection, are not very filling. What is true for steaks is also true for other objects. Anything that exists in reality, even if it is flawed, is much greater than the most wonderful fantasy. Non-existence is a serious metaphysical shortcoming. It follows, therefore, that we have good reason to accept the following metaphysical principle. Existence in reality is greater than existence only in the understanding. If we accept this principle, we can arrive at an intriguing insight. If something exists only in the understanding and not in reality, it is possible to think of something greater. A few more examples may help to clarify this. Suppose that a perfectly grilled steak exists only in the understanding and not in reality. In this case, one can think of something greater, namely, a perfectly grilled steak that also exists in reality. The same is true for Santa Claus. Since Santa Claus exists only in our imagination, we can think of something greater than Santa Claus, namely, a being like Santa Claus that also exists in reality. What is true for perfectly grilled steaks and Santa Claus is also true for all other things. If something exists only in the understanding and not in reality, it is possible to think of something greater than that thing. Let us now go back to the ontological argument. We have seen that an atheist argues that God does not exist, and we now understand this claim in these terms: the greatest being that one can think of exists only in the understanding but not in reality. If we combine this sentence with the principle we have just established, we arrive at the following: it is possible to think of something greater than the greatest being that one can think of. This sentence is, of course, a blatant contradiction. We thus have shown that any atheist who asserts that God does not exist is involved in a contradiction, and therefore, that God must exist. Since the ontological argument is complex, we will summarize its most crucial steps. 1. The idea of God is, by definition, the idea of the greatest being one can think of. 2. If God does not exist, then the idea of God exists only in the understanding but not in reality. Therefore, 3. If God does not exist, then the idea of the greatest being one can think of exists only in the understanding and not in reality. 4. If something exists only in the understanding and not in reality, then it is possible to think of something greater than this thing. Therefore, 5. If God does not exist, then it is possible to think of something greater than the greatest being one can think of. 6. It is impossible to think of something greater than the greatest being one can think of. Therefore, 7. It is false that God does not exist. Lay. God exists. To most people, the ontological argument appears, at least at first glance, like a scam. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860, observed that the ontological argument is nothing more than a charming joke. However, the difficulty is in saying precisely where the argument goes wrong. As long as we cannot do that, the argument remains a potent force in defense of classical theism. We might, of course, object to defining God as the greatest being that one can think of, but it is hard to see anything that is glaringly wrong with defining God in this manner. David Hume pointed out that we can have clear ideas of dogs or cats since those ideas are derived from sense impressions, but that no comparable impressions are available for God. He concluded that we might define God as the greatest being we can think of, but that this definition still leaves us with a fuzzy idea of what kind of being God is. If Hume were correct on this point, the very foundation of the ontological argument would be in doubt. However, Hume's criticism here is not decisive. He seems to think that we can have clear ideas of something only if we can produce a clear mental image of that thing. But having no precise image of God does not mean that we can have no clear idea of what kind of being God is. Consider the idea of the greatest natural number. I have no mental image of that number in my mind, but I can understand the idea very well. In fact, I understand the idea so clearly that I am able to deduce that such a number does not even exist. The case of God is similar. I have no mental image of God in my mind, but I clearly understand the concept of the greatest being one can think of. In fact, I understand it so clearly that I think it might be possible to deduce the actual existence of such a being. However, David Hume raised a second, more powerful objection to the ontological argument. We have seen that the argument is based entirely on a priori considerations, which puzzled Hume and prompted him to reflect on the logical status of existence claims. Suppose somebody claims that polar bears exist. In order to understand this claim, we must understand the concept of polar bears. But more is involved to say that polar bears exist seems to say that there are certain objects in the world that correspond to the concept of polar bears. The claim thus goes beyond the conceptual realm and requires access to the actual world. Hume concluded, therefore, that existence claims can never be analytic. We can analyze the concept of polar bears all we want, but we will never discover thereby whether polar bears in fact exist. Any existence claim seems to require access to matters of fact and can never be a mere analytic judgment. Hume's conclusion that existence claims are always synthetic has been very influential, but it is perhaps less decisive than people have assumed it to be. Defenders of the ontological argument can grant Hume nearly everything he said about the logic of existence claims without undermining the plausibility of the ontological argument. It seems clear, for example, that ordinary existence claims like polar bears exist must be synthetic and not analytic. However, the ontological argument does not deal with ordinary objects, and Hume gave us no reason to think that there might not be exceptions to the general rule. Although existence claims are nearly exclusively synthetic, it is possible that the case of God, the idea of the greatest being one can think of, confronts us with a unique case. It might be the one case in which the existence of a being can be deduced from the concept of that being alone. It is thus possible to maintain that the claim of God's existence can be analytic, even if one agrees with Hume that all ordinary existence claims are synthetic. Historically, the most influential objection to the ontological argument has focused on our understanding of the term existence. If the ontological argument works, we need to maintain that existence is a perfection, i.e., a great-making property. Ever since Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, people have been suspicious about this claim that existence is a perfection. Let me illustrate Kant's objection with the help of an example. Suppose you are looking for a partner with the help of a computer dating agency. Part of the process is to describe the properties you want your dream partner to have, such as the following: athletic, intelligent and fun, rich, good-looking. One thing is clear: the more properties you add to this list, the smaller the pool of potential candidates. Properties have the power to exclude potential candidates. However, consider what would happen if you were to add the property of existence to the list. Athletic, intelligent and fun, rich, good-looking, existing. Notice that the new list does not exclude anybody who has not been already excluded. In other words, anybody who fulfills the first set of requirements will also satisfy the second list of requirements. This observation led Kant to suggest that existence is not a real property and thus not a perfection. If we accept Kant's position, we are able to raise a crucial objection to the ontological argument. We have seen that the argument depends on the principle that if something exists only in the understanding and not in reality, it is possible to think of something greater than this. If existence is not a real predicate, this principle becomes questionable. Kant wrote, "By whatever and by however many predicates we may think a thing, even if we completely determine it, we do not make the least addition to the thing when we further declare that this thing is." According to Kant, if I think about a perfectly grilled steak that exists in reality, I am thinking about the very same thing that I am thinking about when I think about a perfectly grilled steak that exists only in my mind. A perfectly grilled steak that exists in reality is, therefore, not a greater thing than a perfectly grilled steak that exists only in my mind. Thus, existence is not a great-making property of any object. We, therefore, have found reason to reject the metaphysical principle that existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. This is a pretty powerful objection to the ontological argument, and many philosophers have taken it to be fatal. Perhaps the most famous objection to the ontological argument was developed by fellow monk Gonilo shortly after Anselm published his version of the ontological argument. Gonilo wondered whether the ontological argument might not establish too much. If it is possible to prove the existence of the greatest possible being, would it not also be possible to prove, in a similar way, the existence of other perfect entities, like perfect islands or perfect cars? Since we know that perfect islands and perfect cars do not exist, we can conclude that something fundamental has to be wrong with the ontological argument. At first glance, Gonilo seems to have a point. The same reasoning that helps us to establish the existence of the greatest being we can think of, i.e., God, also seems to apply to the idea of the greatest island. If the greatest island we can think of does not exist, there could be an even greater island just like the greatest island, but one that actually exists. Because this island would be greater than the greatest island we can think of, we end up with a contradiction. To avoid this contradiction, we have to admit that our initial assumption, that the greatest possible island does not exist, is false. So, the greatest island must exist. Initially, Gonilo's objection seems a devastating reductio ad absurdum of the ontological argument, but further reflection raises concerns about the cogency of Gonilo's counterexample. It seems clear that the ontological argument can be applied only to entities that have a maximum. For example, consider all beings that are morally good. It makes sense to say that among these beings there must be a best because the property of moral goodness has a maximum. However, the same cannot be said about islands. No single island is capable of being the greatest possible because one could always imagine a greater island. If this line of reasoning is correct, Gonilo's criticism seems much less threatening. It seems false to claim that the ontological argument allows us to prove the existence of a great number of absurd non-existent things. Although Anson's traditional version of the ontological argument has been subject to damaging criticism, the argument has made a comeback in recent years. Norman Malcolm, 1911 to 1990, and Alvin Plantinga, born 1932, are two philosophers who have presented so-called modal versions of the ontological argument. Because the details of the modal versions are rather technical, I will present only the basic outline of this type of argument. The basic idea is to focus the discussion on necessary existence. It seems quite plausible to assume that God's existence is necessary and not contingent, that is, whether God exists is not dependent on any contingent feature of the world. If we grant this plausible assumption, we can present the argument in the following way. 1. God's existence is either necessary or logically impossible. 2. It is not impossible for God to exist, i.e., there is no contradiction involved in assuming that God exists. Therefore, God exists necessarily. The argument is rather seductive and not obviously flawed. The discussion about modal versions of the argument is still in full swing, and it might be a while before a universal consensus has been reached on whether and how this argument is fundamentally flawed. Pascal's wager. The wager argument is due to French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662, who is best known in mathematics for his contributions to probability theory. In philosophy, his most influential work is known as Pensées, or Thoughts, which was not completed before his death and was subsequently edited by others. Pensées provides an exposition and defense of Christian beliefs. However, Pascal did not hold that the existence of God could be proven with the help of reason alone. According to him, what matters most is faith, not reason, and his wager argument should be understood as a springboard to embracing faith. However, the argument, if presented with care, is extremely effective and is worthy of closer analysis. The aim of the argument is not to establish that God exists, but rather that it is pragmatically prudent to believe that God exists. The argument is especially designed for agnostics, that is, those people who think that it is possible that God exists but who do not think that we can know this. In order to understand the wager argument, we first need to understand the concept of expected utility, which allows us to measure the relative value of various possible but uncertain outcomes. Suppose that I offer you the following bet: if you pay me $6, I will let you roll a standard die. If you manage to get a 3, you win and I will pay you $12. If you do not roll a 3, you lose and I keep the $6 you paid me. Is this a good game to play? You have the chance to win $6, but you also have the chance to lose $6. Decisions like these are quite frequently encountered in the real world and are called decisions under uncertainty. When we are facing decisions under uncertainty, we do not know what consequences we are going to face when we decide to perform certain actions. For example, if you choose to play the game just described, you do not know whether you will win or lose. If you win, you are better off, but if you lose, you are worse off. Both are possible outcomes of your decision to play the game. So, what is the rational thing to do? In order to approach this decision clearly, it is useful to set up a decision matrix that summarizes the options and possible outcomes. The matrix would look like this. Obviously, if you refuse to play the game, you will neither win nor lose anything. The expected utility of this decision is 0. But what is the expected utility of playing the game? In order to calculate that, we need to take into account the probability of the various outcomes. The probability of rolling a 3 with a standard die is 1/6. The probability of not rolling a 3 is 5/6. Once we are clear on that, we can calculate the expected utility of playing the game. Expected utility of playing the game is equal to 1/6 into 6 plus 5/6 into minus 6 is equal to 1 minus 5 equals 4. This calculation shows clearly what you may already have suspected. You are much better off not playing the game, since the expected utility of playing the game is negative. The negative number shows that it is rational to expect a loss of $4 if you play the game. The concept of expected utility is a great tool for making rational decisions under uncertain conditions. In general, we can formulate the following guiding principle. When faced with decisions under uncertainty, it is rational to choose the action that promises the highest expected utility. But what does this principle of rational decision theory have to do with God's existence? Actually, there is a direct relationship. Pascal argued that many of us are not certain whether God exists or not. All we can say is that there is a certain probability that God exists and a certain probability that God does not exist. This situation suggests that we can approach the decision of whether or not to believe in God's existence as a decision under uncertainty. The matrix for this decision would look like this. Based on this decision matrix, we can see that the expected utility of believing in God is much higher than the expected utility of not believing in God. For the value of going to heaven is of course infinitely positive, whereas the value of going to hell is infinitely negative. Notice that it does not matter how high the probability is for God's existence. Even if one believes that the probability of God's existence is very, very small, Pascal's wager nevertheless suggests that we should believe that God exists, since the potential gain of eternal life in heaven makes the expected utility of believing in God infinitely large. What the argument shows is not that God exists, but that it is rational and prudent to believe in God's existence, since this belief promises a higher expected utility than not believing in God's existence. In day-to-day terms, the argument might sound like this: come on and go to church. You have nothing to lose and infinitely much to gain. Among all the arguments for the existence of God, this one is often most persuasive. Critics of this argument normally point to two main issues. First, our beliefs are not always under our voluntary control. This point can be illustrated with the help of the following example. Suppose I have to take a calculus exam. I am nervous, but I know that if I believe that I am going to be successful on this exam, I will calm down and perform my best. In this situation, I am better off if I believe that I am going to be successful on the test. However, in spite of the fact that it is prudent for me to believe this, perhaps I simply cannot make myself really believe that I am going to be successful. without wanting to. I start thinking that I will fail this exam because I have always failed math exams. This example shows that what we believe is frequently not a matter of choice, and the same might be true for belief in God. Although Pascal's wager might convince me that it is prudent to believe in God, I might not be able to make myself believe it after all. The second objection to Pascal's wager is more serious. Suppose you are convinced by this argument and want to believe in God. What religion would you choose? Interestingly, a version of Pascal's wager can be presented in defense of a Jewish God, a Muslim God, a Christian God, a Hindu God, and so on. The only condition is that the God in question must promise eternal life to believers and eternal damnation to non-believers. Unfortunately, there seem to be infinitely many descriptions of God that can satisfy that requirement. This problem, normally referred to as the many gods objection, shows that Pascal's wager is not as pragmatically useful as it might seem at first glance. For if there are indeed infinitely many possible descriptions of God available, the expected utility of believing in any one of them becomes rather small. Food for thought. Blackjack, video poker, and roulette, all games offered in a casino, are unfair games, that is, those who play these games are faced with a negative expected utility. In spite of this reality, these games are very popular and make huge amounts of money for the people who own the casinos. Does this mean that all those who play these games are irrational decision makers? Food for thought. What do you think? Is your belief in God or your belief in atheism under your voluntary control? Could you decide, at the drop of a hat, that God exists or does not exist? Or is it perhaps the case that no matter what happens, we would simply continue to believe what we have always believed? The effect of these arguments. None of the arguments for God's existence that we have discussed so far seem strong enough to establish the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfect being beyond all doubt. Objections can be raised to each one of them. Does this mean that belief in God cannot be justified by reason? It is too early to draw such a conclusion. Although none of the arguments alone has been able to prove that God exists, the arguments might have a cumulative effect. Together they might be seen as providing good reasons for belief in classical theism. However, even if the arguments together cannot move us to believe in a classical theistic God, it would be premature to conclude that no argument can establish the existence of such a being. The fact that human thinkers have failed to prove God's existence in the past does not establish that we cannot find such proofs in the future. We have seen that some of the arguments, especially the ontological and the design arguments, are continuously developed and refined. Thus, a more successful version of one such argument might emerge in times to come. We are therefore not justified to announce that it is impossible to prove the existence of God. But might we be able to establish the opposite result and prove that God does not exist? We will turn to this question in the following sections. Arguments against classical theism. 7.4 Analyze arguments that try to establish that evil and suffering disprove the existence of God. On Saturday, 23 March 2002, Rodney P. was killed in a car accident, along with his children Matthew, 8, Jordan, 9, and Rodney, Jr., 10. Their car, rear-ended by another driver, was smashed into the back of a Ford Bronco as they waited at a traffic light. Rodney P. had been a popular minister who spent most of his time helping others. The driver who rammed into his car suffered a medical emergency that caused him to lose control of his vehicle. Tragic events like this happen quite frequently in the world in which we live. People die in car accidents, they suffer diseases, they drown in floods, and they starve in famines. How can a good and benevolent God allow all of this to happen? It would have been so easy for God to spare the life of Rodney P. and his 3 young children. All he had to do was to prevent the driver who smashed into them from suffering a heart attack. Why did God not interfere in this situation? This question leads us to the heart of one of the most powerful arguments for atheism, the problem of evil. This problem can be presented either as a logical problem or as an evidential problem. We will start our discussion with the logical problem. The logical problem of evil. The Scottish philosopher David Hume succinctly expressed the questions that motivate the logical problem of evil. Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able to? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? If God exists and if he is indeed all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, should we not expect the world to be much better than it seems to be? Should we not expect that the hungry will be fed, the needy will be sheltered, and the injured will be healed? Advocates of the logical problem of evil assert that there is a logical tension between these two claims. 1. Evil exists, innocent beings suffer terribly. 2. An all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God exists. According to the problem of evil, these two claims are logically inconsistent with each other, that is, they cannot be true at the same time. However, since the existence of evil is a fact, we must accept that one is true, and we are, therefore, forced to conclude that two is false. If we refuse to draw this inference, we are irrational. The Australian philosopher J. L. Mackie observed, with the help of the problem of evil, it can be shown, not that religious beliefs lack rational support, but that they are positively irrational, that several parts of the essential theological doctrine are inconsistent with one another. If Mackie is right, classical theists are in an uncomfortable position of having to decide whether they want to be rational or whether they want to be theists. They cannot be rational and religious at the same time. Is this tension between theism and rationality unavoidable? In order to answer this question, let us reflect with more care on the structure of the logical problem of evil. Note that assertions 1 and 2 do not form an explicit contradiction, that is, they do not assert that something both is and is not the case. For example, someone who asserts that Smith robbed the bank and yet did not rob the bank is asserting an explicit contradiction. Why then do so many people believe that assertions 1 and 2 are logically inconsistent and cannot be true at the same time? A further example might be helpful to illustrate the logical points at issue. Consider the following two assertions. A. All humans are mortal. B. Hercules is not mortal. Can statements A and B be true at the same time, or are A and B logically inconsistent with each other? Strictly speaking, A does not assert the negation of B, but we can illustrate the logical tension between the two statements by adding a background belief C that is plausible but that allows us to derive an explicit contradiction. Consider background belief C. C. Hercules is human. If we add C to A and B, we can deduce the explicit contradiction that Hercules both is and is not mortal. Something similar is true with respect to the earlier statements I and 2. In this case, too, we can try to add a background belief that allows us to derive an explicit contradiction. For example, we might add 3. 3. An all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God would eliminate all evil. If we add 3 to assertions 1 and 2, we can deduce the explicit contradiction that evil exists and does not exist. Thus, with the help of background belief 3, we can show that 1 and 2 are logically inconsistent with each other, and that the logical problem of evil is indeed a decisive refutation of classical theism. However, this strategy for strengthening the logical problem of evil requires that the statement we add as a background belief is an obvious and necessary truth. Is statement 3 an obvious and necessary truth? Probably not. It seems as if even an all-good arid all-powerful God has no reason to eliminate all evil. Some evil, example, the suffering of innocence, might be necessarily linked to the existence of higher-order goods. To illustrate this line of thought, let us consider an example. Suppose that my neighbor Helen is sick and is suffering terribly from a headache that prevents her from going to work. Helen might ask, why does God not cure my headache? Does God not care about my suffering? I thought he was all good and all-knowing. It might be possible that Helen's suffering will lead to some higher-order good. Perhaps I might decide to help Helen in this situation. I might go grocery shopping for her, and as a result a wonderful and long-lasting friendship might develop between Helen and me. God has no reason to eliminate Helen's suffering. Although Helen's headache is painful and undeserved, it has made the world better by leading to a higher-order good, our friendship. An atheist might object at this point and argue that all higher-order goods could arise without suffering. Could Helen and I not have developed a beautiful friendship without her getting sick? In this case the answer might be yes, but in general it is hard to imagine how all higher-order goods could arise without the existence of some evil and suffering. How could compassion come to be if nobody suffered at all? How could courage appear if nobody got hurt or injured? It follows that it is unreasonable to think that an all-good God would eliminate all evil. God would have reason to eliminate only the evil that did not lead to higher-order goods. We thus cannot accept assertion 3 as an obvious and necessary background belief. Instead, a reasonable person might accept background belief 4. 4. An all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God would eliminate all evil that is not necessary for the development of higher-order goods. However, if we accept 4 and add it as a general background belief to 1 and 2, we can no longer derive an explicit contradiction. In this case, the existence of evil is logically compatible with the existence of God. As a result, classical theists are in a relatively strong position with respect to the logical problem of evil. They can argue that any attempt to derive an explicit contradiction from the claims that God exists and that evil also exists involves background assumptions that are neither obvious nor necessary. A further response to the logical problem of evil was presented by the American philosopher Alvin Plantinga in his Free Will Defense. Plantinga argues not only that it is impossible to derive an explicit contradiction from the existence of evil and the existence of God, but in addition, that there are positive reasons to think that the existence of evil is logically compatible with the existence of God. According to Plantinga, even an omnipotent God would not have complete control over a creation that included genuinely free creatures. In short, Plantinga's free will defense asserts that it is not within God's power to eliminate all evil since God has given human beings the power to act freely on their own. And free humans do not always act for the good but inflict suffering on themselves and others. In other words, a world with free beings that contains no evil is not a logical possibility. It follows therefore that if we accept that 1. God exists and 2. Humans are genuinely free creatures, then we can deduce that 3. Evil exists. We thus should not be surprised to find that the world is full of evil. Evil is a necessary and unavoidable byproduct of human freedom. The fatal accident of Rodney P. illustrates the logic of the free will defense. Rodney R., his 3 children, and the other driver were all free creatures, making their own decisions and thus determining the character of the world. If God had made sure that all their decisions and actions led to outcomes free of suffering, he would have eliminated their free will. Thus, it follows that God's existence is logically compatible with the fact that innocent beings suffer horribly. Food for thought. On 1st November 1775, Lisbon, the capital of the Kingdom of Portugal, was struck by a powerful and devastating earthquake. Since 1st November was the Christian holiday All Saints' Day, many churches in the city were packed with worshippers when the earthquake struck. Approximately 40 minutes after the earthquake, an enormous tsunami engulfed the city's harbor and downtown and drowned many of those who were lucky enough to have survived the collapse of nearly all the buildings in Lisbon. All in all, close to 100,000 people were killed in the natural disaster, which had a profound impact on the European intellectual culture. The 18th century understood itself as the age of reason. Most thinkers in that era advocated that reason helps us to understand not only nature, but also an all-good creator of the universe. But the Lisbon earthquake was an event that seemed to go beyond reason. How could anyone make sense of the fact that thousands of people were killed on a Christian holiday while they were worshipping God? What do you think? Does the Lisbon earthquake defy reason? Is the fact that the earthquake happened good evidence for thinking that there is no omnipotent, all-good creator? Food for thought. The American philosopher David Lewis, 1941 to 2001, suggested an intriguing objection to the free will defense against the logical problem of evil. Lewis pointed out that even if God had given some of his creatures free will, he could have avoided the existence of evil. Since God can foresee what humans will do with their freedom, he could have made it the case that only those humans who freely make the right choices are actually free. Thus, those good humans would use their freedom only to do good, and the others would find themselves unable to carry out their evil deeds. In this way, there could be a world with free will that is free of suffering. Would not an all-good God create such a world rather than the one we live in? What do you think? The evidential problem of evil. As we have seen, the logical problem of evil does not provide a watertight case for atheism. It seems logically possible that an omnipotent God would not eliminate all evil in a world in which human beings have genuine free will. However, there is a more powerful version of the problem of evil available to the atheist, the so-called evidential problem of evil. According to an advocate of this line of thinking, God's existence is logically compatible with the fact that innocent beings suffer and experience evil, but the existence of evil makes God's existence highly implausible. Let us illustrate this line of reasoning with an example. Suppose you are a detective and you are investigating the death of a college student, Peter H., who has been found shot to death in his car. On the seat next to him, the police found a suicide note. His friends confirmed that Peter had been very depressed prior to his death. Two of his best friends report that Peter spoke on more than one occasion about the possibility of committing suicide. In this situation, it seems reasonable to conclude that Peter committed suicide. All the evidence seems to support this assumption. Notice, however, that this conclusion, although compelling, is not certain. It is logically possible that Peter has been murdered, in spite of the fact that all of the evidence points toward a suicide. It is, for instance, logically possible that all his friends are part of a plot to kill him and are therefore lying about his depressed state of mind prior to his death. It is similarly possible that the suicide note was fake, and so on. Although all of this is logically possible, it is extremely improbable and extremely hard to believe. In the absence of further evidence, nobody would seriously believe that Peter's death was murder. The basic reasoning behind the evidential problem of evil applies the same kind of thinking to the relationship between God and the existence of evil. Although it is logically possible that the existence of evil is compatible with God's existence, it is highly improbable that God would allow so much evil to take place in His creation. The amount of pointless suffering in the world makes it irrational to believe that an all-powerful, omnibenevolent God is, in fact, operating behind the scenes. An advocate of the evidential problem of evil might say, yes, of course, God would not necessarily eliminate all evil, because some evil serves a purpose. However, we should expect an all-good God to eradicate all pointless suffering. If the world is full of pointless suffering, we have an excellent reason to think that God probably does not exist. In standard form, we can present the evidential problem of evil as follows. 1. Pointless suffering exists. 2. If God exists, then God would eliminate all pointless suffering. Therefore, God probably does not exist. Premise 2 is plausible in light of our discussion of the logical problem of evil. We have seen that it is unreasonable to expect that God would eliminate all evil and suffering from this world if suffering is connected to the existence of higher order goods. God has no reason to eliminate that suffering or evil. However, if the only reason that God does not eliminate suffering is that it leads to higher order goods, we have to conclude that all suffering that remains in the world must have a point, that is, no pointless suffering exists. Premise 2 is, therefore, very attractive. The problem in this argument is premise 1. Can we be sure that there are instances of pointless suffering? In order to show that there exist many instances of intense, pointless suffering that God could have prevented without thereby losing any greater good, the philosopher William Rowe wrote about a fawn trapped in a distant forest that has caught on fire during a lightning storm. The fawn is horribly burned, suffers for 5 days, and finally dies. If we agree with Rowe and think that this is an instance of pointless suffering, we have found good evidence for thinking that God probably does not exist. Let us reflect more carefully on the structure of Rowe's thinking in this context. His argument can be presented as follows. 1. A fawn is caught in a bushfire and is burned badly. It suffers for 5 days and then dies in great pain. This is one example of suffering that seems completely pointless. 3. If something seems completely pointless, it probably is completely pointless. Therefore, completely pointless suffering probably exists. This inductive argument is attractive. However, it is easy to see that premise 3 can be challenged. How can we be sure that there is no hidden purpose to the suffering of the fawn that only God can see? The fact that we cannot see any point in the suffering of the fawn does not mean that no such point exists. Understanding God's purposes for all instances of suffering in the world might simply transcend our cognitive abilities. This debate between theism and atheism cannot be resolved in a completely objective way. Our conclusions depend in part on how we experience and interpret the suffering that takes place in our universe. If we understand most of the suffering of innocent beings in this world to have a purpose, then it seems quite plausible to believe that all suffering has a purpose, even if we cannot see that purpose in all cases, and that the evidential problem of evil has no merit. If, on the other hand, we see this world as a place in which many innocent beings suffer without rhyme or reason, then belief in an all-good and all-powerful God appears foolish and irrational. Food for thought. The suffering of children seems to raise the evidential problem of evil most forcefully. In the following selection from Dostoevsky's novel The Brothers Karamazov, one of the main characters, Ivan Karamazov, explains to his religious brother Alyosha why the suffering of children makes him reject God. Listen, I took the case of children only to make my case clearer. Of the other tears of humanity with which the earth is soaked from its crust to its center, I will say nothing. It's beyond all comprehension why the children should suffer, and why they should pay for the harmony. Why should they, too, furnish material to enrich the soil for the harmony of the future? I understand solidarity in sin among men, but there can be no such solidarity with children. Some jester will say, perhaps that the child would have grown up and have sinned, but you see he didn't grow up. He was torn to pieces by the dogs at 8 years old, and so I renounce the higher harmony altogether. It's not worth the tears of that one tortured child who beat itself on the breast with its little fist and prayed in its little fist and prayed in its striking out house with an unexplained tear to dear kind God. It is not worth it, because those tears are unatoned for. How are you going to atone for them? Do you agree that the suffering of children raises the evidential problem of evil? Is the suffering of children necessarily pointless, or is it possible that the suffering of children is part of God's plan for the world? Food for thought. An attempt to show that an omnipotent, all-good, and omniscient God might have good reasons for letting innocent beings suffer is called a theodicy. In the list that follows, I describe roughly a number of theodicies. Discuss with others in the class whether these theories are able to show that all suffering of innocent beings has a point. 1. Big Plan Theodicy. All suffering of innocent beings is part of a big plan and has to happen. The whole plan, however, is completely good. 2. Punishment Theodicy. When we see innocent people suffer terribly, they have sinned, their suffering is a punishment for their sins. This solution can be well combined with the idea of original sin, which says that all human beings, including children, are sinners since they are descendants of Adam and Eve. 3. Suffering builds character theodicy. This basic idea is that the suffering of innocents helps them to become stronger. All evil offers one the possibility to learn from it and to grow into a better human being. This theodicy is sometimes called soul-making theodicy. 4. Limits of human knowledge theodicy. The basic idea here is that we simply are too unintelligent to understand why God lets innocents suffer. God has reasons, but we humans cannot understand them. 5. Contrast theodicy. This solution asserts that we need evil in the universe to know that there is good. If there were no evil and everything was good, we could not tell that all was good. 6. Devil theodicy. Innocent beings suffer because the devil likes to let innocents suffer. 7. Test theodicy. The basic idea is that the earthly life is just a test. God has thrown us into this world full of evil and pointless suffering in order to find out what kind of beings we are. Without pointless suffering, this test is not complete. If we pass the test, we are going to heaven. If we fail, some more sinister place awaits us. 8. Free will theodicy. God would like to eliminate all suffering of innocent beings but cannot do so without eliminating free will. A world with free beings and suffering is better than a world without suffering but also without free will. Final remarks on the problem of God's existence. 7.5 Evaluate your position on theism in light of all arguments. Our discussion of arguments for and against the existence of God has shown that classical theists as well as atheists have reasons for their positions. Although none of the arguments are entirely successful, they are strong enough to show that neither of the positions is completely without merit. Where does this leave us? A few summarizing observations are in order. First, we might take the inconclusiveness of our discussion as a reason to embrace an agnostic position. By insisting that we cannot know whether God exists, an agnostic seems to keep all options open. However, agnostics face difficulties of their own. A person who holds that God might exist without firmly believing that he does avoids making any clear decision about God, even though our lives become worthwhile not by avoiding decisions, but by making them. The American philosopher William James pointed out in his essay The Will to Believe that in real life we have to choose what seems most reasonable and promising even if we have insufficient evidence. A person who avoids making momentous decisions runs the risk of avoiding life as well. James illustrated this critique of agnosticism by quoting Fitzjames Stephen. In all important transactions of life, we have to take a leap in the dark. We stand on a mountain pass in the midst of whirling snow and blinding mist through which we get glimpses now and then of paths which may be deceptive. If we stand still, we shall be frozen to death. If we take the wrong road, we shall be dashed to pieces. We do not certainly know whether there is any right one. What must we do? Be strong and of a good courage. Act for the best, hope for the best, and take what comes. If death ends all, we cannot meet death better. This quotation suggests that we might be better off if we make a clear choice and embrace either theism or atheism. Making a decision, even if it is the wrong one, might be better than remaining in a state of indecision. We have also seen that the evidential problem of evil makes a pretty strong case for atheism. However, even if we admit that there is no entirely successful theodicy available, we do not have to abandon belief in God. Instead, we might understand the problem of evil as a refutation of a certain kind of God, namely, the God of classical theism. Some theologians have taken this as a reason to change our traditional understanding of God's nature. Paul Tillich, for example, has suggested that we should not think about God as a being, but rather as a being itself. Whether such alternative conceptions of God are more promising and satisfactory in light of religious experiences depends in part on how we understand the character of religious experiences. No general, universal answer seems to emerge. Study and reflection questions. 1. We have seen that there are different ways to think about God. Even atheists must have a conception of God, for how else would they be able to claim that such a being doesn't exist? Describe various ways of thinking about a supreme being. Do you think that all these ways of thinking about God are equally meaningful? 2. Religious experiences play an important part in religion. It is, however, far from clear what should count as a religious experience. Is a religious experience equivalent to a miracle, or is it simply a feeling of joy, sinfulness, or dependence? Describe various examples that have been labeled as religious experiences and try to distill what, if anything, is common to all religious experiences. 3. What is the difference between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil? Which of these problems poses a more serious threat to theism? How can a theist respond to these challenges? 4. Which of the arguments for the existence of God is the weakest, and which of the arguments is the strongest? Give reasons for your assessment. 5. What effect have the various arguments for and against the existence of God had on your position on religion? Has your perspective changed? If yes, how? If no, why not?